Let me jump ahead here a little bit. Fortitude. Under that, you have patience, magnanimity, perseverance, munificence. Magnanimity. How often are we using that word? You were very magnanimous today. I mean, who's saying that? But we should be using the word because what magnanimity allows us to do is it gives us the right perception on human honors. It tells us how to accept human honor, and we can do it because we recognize where the gifts came from. And humility, having that virtue, or at least working on it, helps us to recognize our own shortcomings. And therefore, we can have magnanimity because of humility, and we don't get big egos. We don't get a big head. We don't get blown up over all of this. The idea of fortitude, and what's important, again, I go back to the virtues, is that if you don't have enough of it, you will be fearful, which is not a good thing. And at the other extreme, you'll be reckless. So it's this idea of balance. It's kind of like the golden rule or the golden mean. That's the idea of virtue. That is what we're trying to work towards. Then we have the theological, which I'm trusting most people in this room are aware of, with faith, hope, and charity. So I won't go into a lot of those. But we could go on and on and on, and we should, individually, talk about virtue. What are they? Use the language, use the words, identify them. John Locke, in his paper entitled Some Thoughts on Education, had this to say about virtue. I place virtue as the first and most necessary of those endowments that belong to a man or a gentleman, as absolutely requisite to make him valued and beloved by others, acceptable or tolerable to himself. Without that, I think he will be happy neither in this nor in the other world. He goes on a little bit further and says, virtue is harder to be got than a knowledge of the world, and if lost in a young man, it is seldom recovered. The idea there being, look at education today has become very utilitarian. It's just about the actual facts of the knowledge in that field of study, whether it's accounting or whatever you want to pick out. But it's lost the idea of the whole person. Why are you going to be an accountant? Why are you going to be an ethical one? Why would you be a moral one? Why would you do the right thing? How is that being taught? Where are we learning those things? And again, sport is this environment that I'm going to maybe explain a little bit more clearly that creates, it's an artificial environment. But it's there, and the reason I'm picking it out is because it's so pervasive. It's everywhere. To some degree, we're all involved in it to some degree. So it makes sense. It's there. We're in it. We're using it. We need to use it in the right way. And I go back and just finish this. He began that paper, his very first sentence in that paper on some thoughts on education were this. He emphasized the importance of training the body. And he opens the paper with a sound mind and a sound body, the Latin mens sana in corpore sano. Think of that. John Locke is recognizing that you're not just a mind. It's body, mind, and spirit. It's the whole person that needs to be developed. And if we're lacking in any one of those areas, you're lacking as a human being. Now, you're taking formation. I don't know about you, I'm not done yet, but formation starts at the beginning. And through that formation, how are we helping those that we're called to form? So as we educate people, how are we educating them to be truly good people, to be good persons, to learn what does that mean to be a good person? So it takes me back, and when he talks about a sound mind and a sound body, it takes me back to that quote I shared with you a few moments ago, the sport, the service of the spirit, where it says, while perfecting the body as an instrument of the mind, it also perfects the mind. Now, so what it's really saying then is this mind is being perfected in a way that's going to help it to seek truth. How is that happening? The body's an instrument of the mind. But it also makes the mind a more refined instrument. Why? Because the body, which the mind has kind of willed and said, you're going to do this, this, and this, whatever the activity is, the body experiencing whatever it is that mind just willed it to do now has an effect back on the mind. Because the body is actually experiencing the world, it's experiencing something, probably some level of pain or sacrifice to be dealt with in some way, and so our mind then becomes more refined. And ultimately what we're coming to seek and see is the truth. That's the benefit to it. So what's important here is that we use the language of virtue, and we refer to them by name, and we identify them when we see them. Richard Weaver, who most of you are familiar with, has a nice way of phrasing it. He says, words have meanings and ideas have consequences. This idea of words, consequences, the things that we say, and then what we do are very important. As I look at coaches, even at Belmont Abbey College, I'm looking for coaches that are teachers and mentors first. I hope they're world-class in their abilities to coach. I mean, of course. But that's not enough for me. I'm looking for somebody that recognizes I've been entrusted with the mind, body, and soul of this individual, And part of my training, this sport environment that's been created, is now going to allow me, it's going to give me this opportunity to actually work with this individual to develop these virtues, the habit of doing good, of becoming a good person. I have this environment. It's perfect. It's plenty of opportunity for it. And, you know, like the good tutor that John Locke refers to in some Thoughts on Education, the good coach is critical to creating the environment that will provide the means for developing the virtues in the athlete. That environment in which coaches, athletes, parents, fans, and whoever else interact has rules and boundaries. That's what makes it so good, because there are rules and boundaries to it. And sport, you know, in creating this opportunity, is a place for practice of virtue and vice. The will, the reason, the intellect, all of these come to bear through participation in sport. This physical aspect I talked about, though, is very important, because we're not just these, you know, ethereal beings kind of floating above the tables here. You know, you got bodies, you know, and they have a way of talking to us, you know, all the time. And so, as I said before, the body and the physical world in some ways helps the intangible to become more tangible. And I'll give you an example. If we were to talk about having courage, we could describe it all day long. We could say courage is, well, you're brave, you're going to do this. I'll give you some examples. That's all great. But when you are finally placed in the environment, in the situation that requires the acting out of courage, it's no longer theoretical. And I'll give you an example. One of my favorite, I guess, situations in sport that I you know, was able to see was there was a Japanese gymnast in 1976 Olympics. His name was Shun, might probably mess up his name, Fujimoto, Shun Fujimoto. And here's the situation. 76 Olympics, the Russian men are the favorites. They look like they're going to win. The Japanese, though, had an outstanding team, and they had a chance. In the 8th event, which is the floor routine, Fujimoto does his routine, and on landing, actually fractures his patella in his knee. That's your kneecap, like right here, okay? And he knows that if he doesn't participate, if he drops out of this, there's no chance the Japanese can win the gold medal in this games. So he doesn't say anything. And he goes over, his next event is the pommel horse, and he does that thinking, well, the pommel horse, you know, maybe I'll be able to get off. And he does. He gets a 9.5 out of 10. But in the landing, even though it wasn't much of a landing, it even injured him further. And by the time it came to the final event, which was the rings, 8 feet up in the air, okay, he is actually ashen gray. He's sweating profusely. He can't get to the mat. He's hobbling over to the mat. The coach actually has to lift him up onto the rings. And he goes through this routine perfectly. Now, people are getting ready to say, okay, yeah, the dismount's the thing, right? I'm telling you, I understand exercise physiology. I understand anatomy, you know, and physiology. You have a fractured kneecap. You're keeping your legs straight on the rings. The contraction of your quadricep, that's what it connects to. Connects to your patella. Just contracting your quadricep would be excruciatingly painful. So going through that whole routine perfectly is remarkable in its own right. And then, of course, comes what everybody's waiting for, the dismount. Here he is rotating through the air off these rings, 8 feet in the air, and if he doesn't stick the landing, they lose. He sticks the landing. I mean, like, solid. Gritting his teeth, you can see it. I mean, you know, it almost wells up my eyes with tears. Why? Because we're hearing truth. We're seeing actual courage. He actually was courageous. We didn't talk about somebody being courageous. That's remarkable. That's powerful. That's what we're called to. And certainly in athletics, that is what we're supposed to be doing with the athletes that we work with.